Alright. So this little graph right here is actually showing the action potential. The process of depolarization of a cardiac myocyte, right? It goes through these couple of phases. Is sodium and potassium the only ions or the only electrolytes that act in this process? No, what's the other? Calcium. Alright, so you've got phase 1. This is where you have a rapid influx of what? Rapid sodium. So this is what gets the process going, right? This is what takes the negative charge of the inside of the cell to what? A positive charge. So the sodium is what actually does most of the depolarization, right? Because depolarization is just changing the poles, right? When something is polarized, that means what? Alright, so it has a positive and a negative charge. Positive on the inside, negative on the outside. When it is depolarized, depolarizing means that that charge has changed. Alright? So the inside of a cardiac cell is depolarized when it goes from a negative charge to a positive charge. Alright? So you got phase 1 here. Alright? Then you got phase 2. Yeah, that's what I said. Phase 0. Then you got phase 1, right? You got phase 2. And phase 3, it may not be exactly right. And then phase 4 is down here, right? Am I right on that? Alright? So, looking at your notes or looking at your book, we know that phase 0 is rapid sodium. Phase 1 is what? Okay, so the sodium channels are closing, so we're having a rapid decline in sodium, right? And now what is coming out of the cell during these phases? Alright? So, we got a decrease in the influx of sodium. Still have an increase of the outflow of what? Okay? So then we get to phase 2. Phase 2 is also called the what? The plateau phase. What happens in phase 2? Alright? What comes in? It's supposed to be end. Also says cane, don't it? So calcium comes in. Why is it necessary for the influx of calcium? What can't happen if calcium doesn't come in? So there's no point in the cell depolarizing if it can't contract, right? You got phase 3. What is phase 3? The terminal phase? And so what's happening? What's happening in phase 3? As evidenced by the graph. This is where we start. Alright? So during repolarization, what's happening to the inside of the cell? So it's the cell is becoming negative. And then phase 4 is what? Alright, so that means that the cell is negative and the outside is positive, right? There's still a little bit of potassium that's coming out, but phase 0 is where you've got a rapid influx of sodium. Then phase 1, it starts slowing down a little bit. Yes?
At what point in that phase is the heart actually contract?
It's going to be in phase 2 whenever the calcium starts coming in, because the calcium is what's making it actually contract. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, this terminal phase is when they're going to start. You're really going to have the outflux of sodium and the influx or the inflow of potassium. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So, did I answer the question? Okay. So then you've got a couple of these refractory periods, right? Where's the start of the absolute refractory period? Look at your notes or look at your book. What? I'm sorry? All right. So your absolute refractory period will be kind of right in here, right? Maybe a little bit farther over. And then you have this relative refractory period. Absolute refractory period is when we've just flushed the toilet and we can't act on it anymore, right? Absolute refractory period. The cardiac cell is in the process of depolarization and it cannot have any type of outside influence. All right? So, which one, absolute or relative, which one's the more dangerous refractory period? The relative, right? Because the cell has started to relax. It has started to repolarize, right? But an outside stimulus can act on it, and so it could, in theory, not completely relax and then start working again. And the problem with that is that all the sodium and potassium hasn't been taken in and out, right? All the calcium isn't ready to come back in, and so you're going to start having some dysrhythmias because the cells are going to be contracting, but they're not going to be contracting where they need to do. What was the property of a cardiac cell that makes it go crazy when it's acted on by an outside influence? Excitability, or irritability could go along with it. Excitability. So that's where the excitability is really going to be a problem. When they start getting acted on by an outside influence, they're going to start getting all excited and getting ready to party again, but they're not ready to party again. They haven't rested up. They still got a bad hangover. Whatever you want to say, they're not ready to work all the way. Make sense? So this whole graph right here is what happens in one cardiac contraction, right? And this is just looking at one cell, but really in reality it's millions of cardiac cells, right? Or billions. I don't know how many's in there. But there's a lot of them, right? Well, the point in between the second phase and over here to the fourth phase, that's going to be the relative refractory period. And so, each one of the phases is relative to a certain point on the EKG, right? What wave is right here? The P. So then you've got your Q, R, S, right? And then you got your T. All right, so we know that the ST, the area in between the ST is going to be where we're going to start having repolarization, right? So it kind of makes it kind of obvious what phase goes where. We know that during the QRS, that's when the most contraction is happening, right? So So it doesn't take near as much energy to contract the atria, but it takes a lot of energy to contract the ventricles. So this is where the rapid influx of sodium is going to come in, and it's going to contract the ventricles. All right? Then we know the T wave is actually what? Ventricular repolarization, right? And so that's where you're going to start having that phase here, and then you're going to get to the resting potential. And so the term that you may see when the resting potential gets acted on is R on T phenomenon. And that's not a good thing. So phase 0 is the rapid depolarization. Phase 1 is the early rapid repolarization. Phase 2, the plateau phase, or prolonged phase of repolarization of action potential. So really and truly, all of your depolarization is occurring in what phase? Phase 0, right? Phase 0. The rest of the phases is repolarization. So we've had that sudden jolt, we've got that sudden change of electricity, and now they're starting to slowly repolarize. Phase 2 is where calcium comes in, and phase 3 is the terminal phase of rapid repolarization. You like it? Yeah, would it be better if I drank it like that? Then phase 4 is that period between action potentials, also the resting time. So we talked about the refractory period. So a better definition: the absolute refractory period when the cardiac muscle cell cannot respond to any stimulation, regardless of how long the stimulus is applied. Nothing can happen. Then the relative is when the cardiac muscle cell is more difficult than normal to excite, but it can be stimulated, depending on the length of the contraction or the stimulation. So what's the whole point in the refractory period? What's the whole point in the cardiac cell having that absolute refractory period? So that it can rest, right? It's went through this sudden jolt of electricity. It's done its work. It needs time to rest. Under normal situations, your heart isn't going to get acted on until it's ready for its action potential again, until it's ready for its 0 phase. But there's certain situations, certain anomalies, certain diseases, and even outside influence, drugs and things like that could actually make you go into the R on T phenomenon. The refractory period of the atrial muscle is much shorter than that of the ventricles. Yeah. The refractory period of the ventricles is about the same duration as that of the action potential. So it takes just about that whole phase 0 to phase 4 for the ventricles to contract and then to relax. The atria contracts in that first little part, and then it's relaxed. Now, why don't we see a atrial repolarization wave?
Covered up.
Right. It's there. The atria does repolarize, and it does emit a signal, but the ventricle is covering it up because it's a much stronger impulse. Just a little bit of critical thinking. When we look at an EKG, when we look for an MI, we're looking at what? The ST segment. The ST segment is going to be in what phase?
Between phase 1 and phase 1.
Alright, so it's going to be in the relative refractory period, and it's going to be on towards the rapid repolarization, or the terminal phase there. What's going to be a problem if we have an MI and we have sick cardiac muscle? It's going to take a lot longer for things to happen, right? It's going to take a lot longer for, if depolarization can even occur, it's going to take a lot longer for it to become repolarized. So if we extend the repolarization period out, that's also going to extend the which refractory? The relative. So if sick cardiac muscle takes longer to repolarize, what does that mean for it? It means it has the potential to be irritated and to be stimulated again. And so that's why a lot of times you will see PVCs, or you will see even VTAC, or some of the other deadly arrhythmias, because the stimulus has happened on those ventricles during their relative refractory period. The rest of the heart has repolarized and it's ready to go again, but the ventricles aren't ready. And so when we start getting that electrical stimulus and they haven't repolarized, what's going to happen? They're going to get excited and they're going to start throwing all kinds of ectopic rhythms. Does that make sense? Make sense to you guys? I need a yes or a no. And so we talked about that.
The heart's conduction system controls the generation and propagation of electricity. The heart's conduction system controls the generation and propagation of electrical signals, or action potentials, that cause the heart's muscles to contract and the heart to pump blood. This electrical activity can be measured at electrodes placed at specific points on the skin, from which a composite recording is produced in the form of a graph. This recording is known as an electrocardiogram, or ECG, sometimes referred to as an EKG, a tracing of the overall electrical activity of the heart, resulting from the propagation of many action potentials. Let's look at what happens during a single beat of the heart and how these events are depicted on an ECG. In a normal heart, each beat begins in the right atrium with an action potential signal from the sinoatrial or SA node, the heart's natural pacemaker. The signal spreads across both atria, causing the muscle cells to depolarize and contract, inducing a phase known as atrial systole. On the ECG, this atrial depolarization is represented by the P wave. The period of conduction that follows atrial systole and precedes the contraction of the ventricles is depicted on the ECG by the PR segment, a flat line following the P wave. When the signal leaves the atria, it enters the ventricles via the atrioventricular or AV node, located in the interatrial septum. It enters the bundle of His and spreads through the bundle branches and the large diameter Purkinje fibers along the ventricle walls. As the signal spreads through the ventricles, the contractile fibers depolarize and contract very rapidly, inducing ventricular systole. The ECG's QRS complex represents this rapid ventricular depolarization. Atrial repolarization also occurs at this time, but any atrial activity is hidden on the ECG by the QRS complex. Finally, as the signal passes out of the ventricles, the ventricular walls start to relax and recover, a state described as ventricular diastole. The dome-shaped T wave on the ECG marks this ventricular repolarization. On the ECG, the ST segment depicts the period when the ventricles are depolarized. The QT interval represents the time it takes for both depolarization and repolarization of the ventricles to occur. The sequence of events just described and the associated ECG trace repeats with every heartbeat. Remember, an ECG is not a tracing of a single action potential, but an amalgamation of the many action potentials that constitute the electrical activity of the heart.
All right. Most of that was kind of old news to you guys, I know. But that's what we're getting into in the next few minutes. So we're going to get into the actual anatomy of the electrical system. This shouldn't take us long at all. So the electrical conduction system is composed of two nodes and a conducting branch. What are they? What are your two nodes?
SA and AV.
SA and the AV node. And they're really comprised of what? Yeah, cardiac cells. So it's a whole bunch of them grouped together. Then what's the conducting branch? You got the internodal pathways and you got the bundle of His that turns into the what? Well, it turns into what before the Purkinje? Right and left bundle branches. And then it actually goes into a couple of other little branches that are all Purkinje fibers, but they're named after their pathways. So the SA node is a dominant pacemaker, right? The SA node is what controls your heart rate in a healthy individual. The inherent or the intrinsic heart rate of the SA node is what? 60 to 100. So when the heart contracts, I think I might have asked y'all that this last week. It might have been my other class. When the heart contracts, does the right side contract and then the left side, or does the top contract then the bottom? The top to the bottom, right? But now there's not a node on the left atrium to make it contract, right? So how does it receive its signal? Through the internodal pathways and through the properties of conductivity, contractility, and all that. So when the SA node fires, we're going to have these electrical currents. It's going to go over and hit the left atria. It's going to hit the right atria. Then it's going to come down to the AV node. The AV node is the atrioventricular node. It is at the atrioventricular septum, right? It's also called supraventricular. When we get into rhythms, supraventricular rhythms are going to usually be a result of a misfiring with the AV node or a problem with the AV node. Okay? Or it really could be anything that's above the ventricle, but most of the time it's going to originate with the AV node. What does the AV node do with the electrical stimulus? Briefly. It holds it, right? To allow what? To allow ventricle filling and allow the atria to do what? It allows for the atrial kick, right? I could be one of those dancing girls, couldn't I? Yeah, I could be a rockette. My little girl loves to watch them. All right, so once it holds up and it allows for ventricular filling, it then goes down the bundle of His, right? The bundle of His then bifurcates into the left bundle branch and the right bundle branch, and then they further branch off into the Purkinje fibers or the Purkinje fibers. Pretty easy stuff. Y'all got a pretty good understanding of that electrical pathway, right? We don't really need to spend a lot of time with this, right? Everybody good with that? The left bundle branch, it subdivides into the anterior, superior, and posterior inferior fascicles. Basically, it's going to supply electricity to the anterior and the superior, so the top and the front, and then the back and the bottom, right? Because all areas of the heart, the ventricles and the atria, they can't just receive a stimulus and just contract on the front side, right? They've got to contract fully. So it's got to be a full contraction. Now there's a third fascicle of the left bundle branch that innervates the interventricular septum and the base of the heart. What's the interventricular septum? It's this big area of tissue right here in between the ventricles. Some of your arrhythmias, you may have problems with your septum there. And then the bundle branches, they subdivide into smaller branches. The smallest ones are called the Purkinje fibers or Purkinje fibers that just wrap around the heart, right? The Purkinje fibers, they spread the electrical impulse from the cell to the cell through what? Through what? What's it called? Conductivity, right? Just those simple terms. Those of y'all that's had me before, y'all know that I'm not a real complex person. And those of you that's had me before also know that I don't ask very clear questions when I'm up here, but most of the time I'm just wanting the simplest answer, right? So, in order for the ventricles to depolarize, there's got to be this rapid influx of electricity conducted down to the ventricles. The cells need to contract really at about the same time, right? Because what would happen if I had an action potential here that was earlier than down here? I'm just looking at the ventricle. What would happen if the top part of the ventricle contracted before the bottom part?
Fight each other.
Yeah, we're going to have a mismatch of the pump, right? So we're not going to have a good pumping. And again, this is what I told my students last night when we were talking about cardiac stuff. The bottom line for the electrical system is to supplement the mechanical system because we've got to have good what coming out of the left ventricle? Good cardiac output, right? So this all has to work in concert together. It all has to work in concert together to get the end result of having good cardiac output. So the electrical system is a supplemental system to the mechanical system because the mechanical system is what's actually providing blood and oxygen to the heart, to the body, right? We can have a good heart rate all day, but if the mechanical system doesn't work, then if we don't have good cardiac output, it doesn't matter, right? So in general, skeletal and smooth muscle, it really only contracts in response to impulses from the CNS or from the endocrine system or whatever. Cardiac fibers, they don't need the central nervous system to tell them what to do. They're their own boss, right? They've got that principle of what? Automaticity, in which they can create their own thing. The pacemaker cells, they depolarize in a repetitive manner. Why? Why do they need to be in a repetitive manner? To keep the heart beating. The heart needs to beat in a rhythm. It needs to work together. Now this rhythm activity occurs because the pacemaker cells don't have a stable resting membrane potential, meaning that their job is to depolarize. Their job is to create this rhythm, right? And so, really and truly, they don't have time. Ain't nobody got time for that, right? Ain't nobody got time to be resting if I'm trying to pace the heart, right? So, that's why they have to continue to beat. What's the problem if they don't continue to beat in rhythm? You start getting what? Dysrhythmias, right? And then you start getting poor cardiac output. If the SA node fails, what picks up? The AV node. However, it's not always the AV node. You could have ectopic foci in the heart because remember, what is the principle of all cardiac cells? Automaticity. So if some of the cells in the atria don't like the AV node and they think they can handle it on their own, then they may start firing. This is called an ectopic beat. Alright? The problem with this is that they're not designed to control the heart. They're not designed to create the rhythm of the heart. They are designed to pick up the impulse from the SA node and continue it down. So if they start creating their own pacemaker rhythm, is it going to be faster or slower? Much slower. I think we talked about that. So the principle of automaticity means that the cardiac cells can act as a fail-safe. All right, if the SA node fails, then they're going to pick up. And now that's okay for a little while in most situations because the body compensates, right? But what did you learn in advanced EMT about the body compensating? It don't do a very good job of it, right? It's nothing like when the body compensates, it's nowhere near as good as if it's in a normal homeostatic balance. The backup cells are called the intrinsic pacemakers, and they're arranged in a cascade fashion, which means that these cells, these electrical cardiac cells, even though they've got the property of automaticity, they are arranged in a way in which they can conduct the electrical activity on down, okay? So they're kind of like in their own little power line, right? Remember the internodal pathways and all that? But what's the problem? If we've got a heart and the SA node gets sad and it doesn't work anymore, and we've got these ectopic foci here that start picking up, what's the problem with it just creating an impulse that's going down this way? What's going to make this work? Right? So what has to happen is when they create the beat, it has to go back up and then come back down. And so that's not good because the cardiac electrical conduction needs to just go down in a rhythmic fashion. When you start having it come back up and going back down, coming back up and going back down, then you start getting out of rhythm and you start having problems. I wish I had some more interesting stuff to teach you guys because you all are about to fall asleep. I'm just going to blame it on Miss McCoy. So the intrinsic rate of the SA node, what does intrinsic mean? What? The built-in, the natural, right? I thought you were saying guilty. It's like, what are you guilty of, Brian? The SA node has an intrinsic rate of 60 to 100. That's what normally paces. If the SA node fails, the AV node will pick up. That's 40 to 60. The problem with the AV node is that the atria is really not going to get a pump, right? Because where's the AV node? It's right here, right above the ventricle. Yes?
When it's firing at the ectopic location, is that what inverts the P wave?
In some situations, what would actually invert the P wave is if it fired, but it went back this way first instead of this way. All right, and it's all relative to the positive and negative lead, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes.
So it's inverting because it's actually going backwards.
Right, that's right. And then the ventricles, they will pick up, and that's going to be a very last-ditch effort. We'll learn about ventricular rhythms that really, sometimes they can perfuse. We've talked about in the past, we've talked about VTAC with a pulse. So it's perfusing a little bit, but it's really not working that good. If the SA node, if the atria is not getting contracted, and only the ventricles are getting contracted, how is blood getting into the ventricle? It's really just by gravity only, right? And so we're not going to get that atrial kick. We're not going to get that extra blood. So we're not going to get that extra blood to go to the lungs. We're not going to get that extra blood to come from the lungs back into the left side. And in turn, if we're not getting that good preload in, we're not getting good what out? Afterload, well, cardiac output, right? Cardiac output. The left, just briefly, the SA node, it fires, it spreads through, it goes through a couple of different tracks. The AV node, the Bachmann's bundle is what's in the left atrium. This is the Bachmann's bundle. This is what actually stimulates the left atrium, okay? Then you got the Winkie-Box tract in the middle of the internodal tract, the Winkie-Box tract, and then Thorell's tract. Really and truly, really want you to know the basics here, okay? Have an idea about this Bachmann and Winkie-Bock and Thorell's. We'll see Winkie-Bock again, but it's going to be in relation to a dysrhythmia. Alright, so here's some information that's going to be pretty important as we get into looking at EKGs. The impulses travel directly from right to left atrium into the base of the right atrium, and from the base of the right atrium it goes to the ventricles, right? So what it actually does is it goes by this Botman bundle. Let me do this if I can figure it out. So it goes by this Bachmann bundle here, and it sends the electrical impulse to the left atria, but then it all comes back around back to here, right? What's right here? The AV node. So it doesn't have its own tract where it goes down and stimulates the ventricle by the left side. It follows this circuit and it comes back here. Does that make sense? About 0.04 seconds is required for impulse of the SA node to spread to the AV node. Write that down. Remember that number, 0.04. Remember that number. Now, you guys will have to, if you want this PowerPoint, you're going to actually have to get it off of Canvas. You can't get it in the student supplement PowerPoint stuff because this is a PowerPoint I used last year. The other one didn't go into detail that I wanted it to. Yeah, it should have been, but I went in and actually made some changes and stuff. So really, all of your PowerPoints, I'm going to put them on Canvas for you, the ones that I actually use in class. All right? So from there, propagation of action potentials. What does that mean? Propagation of action potentials. What does propagation of action potential mean? It means it's stimulating the cells to go through their action potential. Remember the whole wave, plateau phase, zero phase, one phase, all that? So there, it actually takes that stimulus, that electrical stimulus, because again, it takes that electrical stimulus from the cardiac cell to start going through that electrical potential, or that action potential. That means electrical potential. As a result, a delay of 0.11 seconds occurs from the time the action potential reached the AV node until they pass to the atrioventricular bundle. Why does it have that delay? To allow for ventricular filling. A total delay of 0.15 seconds allows atrial contraction to be completed before ventricular contraction begins. And so what's happening in those last points of a second with the atrial contraction? The atrial kick, right? It's kicking that last 10 to 40% of blood back down into the ventricles, right? Because the atria still works off the principle of gravity, right? Because it's sitting above the ventricle. And so it's not all going to go in. And so it has to have that extra kick, that extra little squeeze. So once it hits, after it gets the AV node, it hits the bundle of His and goes out to the what? Left and right what? Which then bifurcates into what? The Purkinje fibers, right? So what this is we are creating an action potential in the SA node, and through the process of conductivity and contractility, we're propagating this action potential all the way down. All right, so it has to go in a rhythmic fashion. It has to go by this power line, if you will, and you will. All right? Simultaneously, the left ventricles are going to, or left and right ventricles is going to contract and release, and then we're going to enter into what? Repolarization, resting potential, right? So the autonomic nervous system does have an effect on the heart, and really and truly on the most basic level, what effect does the autonomic nervous system have on the heart? Yeah, it helps control rate. It would help control systemic vascular resistance, right? It would help control how hard the heart is working. but mainly it's going to control rate. Acetylcholine is the chemical mediator of what? Sympathetic or parasympathetic? Acetylcholine. Parasympathetic. Parasympathetic. Parasympathetic nervous system is going to do what to the heart? Going to kind of slow it down. It's going to cause the cell membrane of the SA node to become more permeable to potassium ions. So if we're having more potassium ions enter into the cell instead of sodium ions, what's it going to cause a delay in? The action potential, right? Because it takes a whole lot of what inside of the cell to create that negative or that positive charge? Sodium. So the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, is going to release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to tell the cardiac cell, hey, open your gates up a little bit more for more potassium to come in to kind of block off the sodium coming in. It's going to slow it down just a little bit. Does that make sense? The parasympathetic nervous system does what to the heart? Slows it down. That's how it slows it down. It lets it keep more potassium in the cell than sodium. Sodium causes the cell to do what?
That's right.
All right? And so, potassium is going to cause the cell to do what? Slow down just a little bit. All right? So sodium doesn't actually cause it to contract, but it actually causes it to start its action potential, right? It causes it to become positive. It delays the pacemaker reaching the threshold. That's an important term, the threshold. The threshold is going to be the amount of action potential or the amount of sodium that it takes in order for a contraction to occur, in order for us to go from phase 0 to phase 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. All right? Does that make sense? So it's going to increase that threshold, meaning it's going to take more for it to actually contract. So that's how the parasympathetic nervous system works. But it releases acetylcholine, but what also does the parasympathetic nervous system control? The vagus nerve, right? So, vagal stimulation is also going to make the parasympathetic nervous system act, and it's going to slow the heart down. That's one of the first treatments that we do, one of the first interventions we do for a person that's what? Tachycardic, right? We're going to get them to do what? Poop on themselves? Or try to at least, right? Or you can throw some cold water on their face or do all kinds of mean things to them, right? A carotid sinus massage is an example of that. And that's where you go in and massage the carotids. That's not recommended, and as a matter of fact, that's contraindicated for us to do, all right? Because we could cause somebody to stroke. Excessive vagal stimulation may result in a systole. Ever heard of anybody dying on the pooper?
Yep.
All jokes aside, I had a really good friend whose dad actually, he went into cardiac arrest. He was a really big guy that was all buff, and then he got fat because he quit working out, and he went out. That's a heck of a way to go out. But that's because of that excessive vagal stimulation, right? This is the dumbest thing that I have ever heard in my life. I've never heard of this until I saw this. A systole at times is referred to as ultimate bradycardia. What the deuce? A systole is referred to as dead, right? Bradycardia, I think of bradycardia as a slow heart rate. We got something, but a systole ain't no bradycardia. It is you're dead. We talked about unintentional vagal stimulation. Some more of the autonomic nervous system. Norepi is going to be the chemical mediator of what? Sympathetic. Epinephrine, norepinephrine. What does sympathetic nervous system do? Speeds up the heart. Why does it do it? Because it releases norepinephrine, or epinephrine. Epinephrine is also called what? Adrenaline, right? Fight or flight. Starts working on the heart, makes things get excited, makes it start increasing. It increases the pacemaker discharge rate. So what it does, it increases the flow of potassium and calcium ions into the cell during depolarization of the action potential. But more importantly, it increases the influx of calcium cells, right? And calcium cells is what does what? What? Causes the contraction. So sympathetic stimulation is going to lead to an increase in heart rate. It's also going to create more force of contraction, all right? What is increasing the force of contraction going to do to the heart? Okay, so it's going to increase the output, but what is it going to do to the myocardial cells? It's going to make them tired, just tired. Ectopic beat. I've already talked about this. This is when the heart contracts from cells other than those in the SA node. When the SA node fails, or either the heart's been extremely excited. Anybody ever heard of a PVC? A PVC is an ectopic beat. It is a premature ventricular contraction. All right, the SA node and all that's firing okay, but then one of the ventricles is like, hey, I want to party too, and then it creates a stimulus and it makes it contract. And that's where it comes in, okay? So that's an ectopic beat. Also called premature beats. Now, if the SA node fails and these ectopic beats actually become the pacemaker, then it's actually called an ectopic foci, ectopic focus. That's going to be important when we get into some of the rhythms. I got about 8 minutes and then we're going to go on break. Y'all good? So depending on the location, you may have premature complexes from the atria, from the junctional. Where's the junctional at? What's the junction? The what junction? AV. Throwing up my gang signs. The AV junction. All right? Or the ventricle. So if it comes from the atria, it's going to be known as a premature atrial contraction. That will be shown as sometimes as a QRS, but no P wave. Junctional, if we have a PJC, let me rephrase that. Atrial, sometimes we're going to see just an extra P wave, a P wave that doesn't really go with anything else, okay? With a junctional, we may see, if a junctional rhythm occurs, then we're going to see a QRS but no P wave. Why? Where is the electrical activity originating? At the AV junction. So it's going to bypass the atria completely. And then ventricular, what is that going to be? What did I just talk about? A PVC, right? If you've ever drank an excessive amount of Red Bull or Monster drinks or something, yeah, I'm sure you have. Yeah, Adderall, stimulants and stuff is going to cause PVCs from time to time. It may be intermittent, as in the case with like a PVC, or it may be sustained if the pacemaker, dominant pacemaker cells fail. Two basic ways that ectopic impulses are generated are by enhanced automaticity and reentry. So if you've never heard those terms before, what do you think enhanced automaticity is going to be? It's going to have extra excitation and it's going to be very, very exciting and it's going to cause other cells to fire. What do you think reentry is? It's going to be the reentry of the electrical stimulus back into the system. It's bypassed something and it's coming back in. Enhanced automaticity caused by acceleration and depolarization. So it could be from excessive stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, certain medications would cause it. As a result, the electrical impulse formation in the potential pacemakers increases beyond their inherent rate. What do you think that's going to cause? If we're having more electrical charge to the SA node than what it's used to at 60 to 100, what's it going to cause? Tachycardia. All right, so that's just another way of explaining how tachycardia occurs. The SA node gets ultra excited, goes beyond its inherent rate of 60 to 100, and it starts beating faster. enhanced automaticity is going to be responsible for several dysrhythmias in the Purkinje fibers. What do the Purkinje fibers, what do they stimulate? The ventricles. So we may have some ventricular issues. And these are some of the examples of what may cause. Bottom line, all these things are going to cause excessive cell stimulation. All right? Excessive catecholamines. Catecholamines is another term for the chemical mediators of the sympathetic nervous system. Digitalis toxicity, that's a medication. Hypoxia. Why would hypoxia cause excitation? Yeah, the cells don't get oxygen, they get excited, right? They start getting irritable. Hypercapnia, which is what? High CO2. Increased venous return. So if we have an increase in preload, the body or the nervous system is going to tell that right atria, hey, you got a lot more fluid. You need to do what? Pump it out quicker, right? You need to get it out quicker, right? Excessive fluid, the pump's backing up. We need to try to get it out quicker. And then hypokalemia. What is hypokalemia? Potassium. So if we lack potassium, we know that potassium is very important to be inside the cell to keep it from doing what? Gaining that positive charge, right? So if we don't have enough potassium to keep it negative, it's going to continue to stay positive, right? So it's going to continue to do what? Contract, right? Y'all following me? Seen this? Heard about this? All right. I got 10:58. Let's be back at 11:10. All right, reentry. This is a term that you'll need to know. And so, reentry is the reactivation of myocardial tissue for a second or subsequent time by the same electrical stimulus. So we know that under normal circumstances, whenever the SA node fires, it shoots that electrical stimulus through the whole heart, and each of those myocardial cells are only acted on one time, right? That's what keeps that cascade, that rhythm flowing, is that they each get acted on one time. So a re-entry stimulus is going to be if there is part of the electrical conduction system that is messed up or delayed and it cannot get through that particular part of the conduction system. And so what it has to do is bypass and re-enter. It can enter cardiac cells that have just become repolarized, and re-entry may produce single or repetitive ectopic beats. Now, what could potentially be the problem with this one? If we're having an electrical signal that's about to reactivate a cardiac cell that has just become repolarized or is in the process of being repolarized. Okay? It couldn't be as strong because it hasn't rested all the way, but what happens if that electrical signal hits it during its refractory period? The relative refractory period. Then we start getting some excited beats, and we may even get into that R on T phenomenon. So, basically, what this is the normal flow, all right? So this is the action potential that's propagating all the way down. And so it would come across both of these branches and then come on down, all right? So it's going to come and go there and come down, all right? This is an example of what happens with reentry. So the electrical signal comes, it goes down, and it goes down here. But there's a problem here. It can't continue to go down here. All right, are y'all following me? So let's just say that this is ischemic tissue. This is ischemic cardiac tissue. So this part is going to act on it, but it's going to be a lot slower. And what's going to happen is this is going to come up, and then the electrical signal is going to say, hey, these cells aren't depolarized. so I'm going to go up and hit them. And so both of these are going to meet, and so possibly they may get depolarized again. That's re-entry.
So the cells get depolarized?
They did, but it's a lot slower. And so that's where the re-entry, they may get polarized the second time as well. And the description that it gives right here is, this is an example of re-entry with the terminal Purkinje fibers. A is normal. The conduction velocity is uniform, so everything's going down. And B, the conduction through a severely depressed segment of the Purkinje fiber. The impulse travels normally through normal tissue and is blocked by the severely depressed tissue, but returns with delay through this tissue from the opposite direction. Alright? So it's really blocked here, or it's really slow, and so it comes back. And now we know that the electrical potential, the electrical route, it has to go in a normal uniform fashion. So the problem is that you're going to have these re-entry beats, and we're actually going to start sending the stimulus the wrong way. Remember, it all has to go this way. Following me? Making sense? A lot of times you can have re-entry dysrhythmias in the SA, AV, bundle branches, anywhere. And all these are different rhythms that we'll get into that are cause of re-entry. An example of re-entry, premature impulse may find one branch of conducting pathway that's still refractory from the passage of the last normal impulse. Refractory means is what? In the process of what? Repolarization. If this occurs, the impulse may pass somewhat slow along a parallel conducting pathway. The electrical action potential, if it gets blocked, it's going to find some type of collateral path, all right, collateral flow. And it's still got a goal of trying to stimulate those cardiac cells, and so it's going to find another route other than the normal route. And remember, if we start getting cardiac cells stimulated or excited that aren't part of that normal cascade, then we start getting into dysrhythmias. By the time that the impulse reaches a previously blocked pathway, the blocked pathway may have had time to recover its ability to conduct. So it may have went all the way through the refractory period, and now it's ready to be stimulated. What do you think the most common cause of delayed or blocked electrical conduction would be? MI, ischemia, right? Certain drugs may do it. We talked about kind of how the sympathetic nervous system acts on the conduction system. Certain drugs would stimulate that or the parasympathetic. Or hyperkalemia, which is an excess of what? Potassium. So we're going to get on into some other stuff, cardiac dysrhythmias. All the stuff that we just talked about, the electrical pathways, disruption in the electrical pathways are what causes the cardiac dysrhythmias. All right? But what I want you to keep in mind when you get into the dysrhythmias, and we're not actually going to start talking about the particular ones or anything for another week or two. But what I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about that is, number one, what part of the electrical conduction system is it acting on? And number two, how is it influencing cardiac output? All right? Because remember, it all goes back to what? Cardiac output. We need good cardiac output. Like my picture?
Clear.